All right, we're on Genesis 38. I think we did John MacArthur and finished him. Is that correct, Cindy? And we were moving on to Worsby, and then Amber is going to read Tony Evans. So whenever you're ready, Kathy, if there's any thoughts or if you guys had anything you thought of after study yesterday that you want to share, please do.
I had looked up that Tamar in this book. There was a couple of interesting things in that book that I thought I might want to share about her. I mean, in my opinion, she's one of those people you don't hear a whole lot about. We
Hmm.
typically hear a lot about certain people, but then there's other ones. There's a little bit, and that's about it.
Yeah, like Enoch.
Yeah. Um, but in here, first of all, it said that the Bible's silent about her genealogy, and we know that she was a Canaanite. Um, and then it says that about she married I guess his name is the oldest son of Judah and Shoah, um, who, like Tamar, was also a Canaanite. I guess that's Judah's wife. I guess was the Canaanite. Um, what did to displease God, we are not told because remember God killed him, but we don't really know why. But whatever it was sinful enough for God to slay him. Um, and then it goes on to say that there's no sins that God doesn't see that any of us do, I guess. Um, then Onan was Tamar's second husband, but he failed to fulfill his responsibilities, so um, therefore God slew him. Um, and then it says, widowed again, in the ordinary course of events, the next son of Judah was Shelah, which we learned yesterday was younger, and Judah promised him when he got of age that she would be his wife. Um, but then he didn't fulfill that. Um, and then it says, although we have no evidence of Tamar's faith in Jehovah, she must have had some conception of the important messianic significance of the line of Judah, which kind of, when I thought about that, I thought, well, how would she know that? I mean, is it just something she kind of felt? Did she have some kind of prophetic something happened that she knew that? Um,
I kind of feel like she might have been a difficult like why were all these men like, oh, I don't want a child to her?
yeah,
Like what was
yeah.
it about her that they did not want to even really have relation with her?
Well, and then we talked about yesterday about that. The second one didn't want him to have the first one's name.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that was the culture that typically happened anywhere, what was the big deal? I mean, I guess if that's typically the way things were handled, what is the big deal? It's not like they were the first people that ever, I guess, had that happen. But um, and then of course it goes into how she trapped Judah into um, having sex with her. Um, it says after the death of his wife Shua, Judah was stricken with grief, and he was bereft of his two wicked sons, and now his wife, who was, in spite of her adulterous nationality, had nothing against her character. Um, then he went get to get the prostitute and then lay with her. Um, Learning that Tamar had been playing the harlot, he commanded, "Bring her forth and let her be burnt." Um, but when he learned that he was the cause of her guilt, Judah was compelled to vindicate Tamar and was forced to admit she had been more righteous. Judah was motivated in the despicable conduct by sensual lust alone, but Tamar by nobler motives, namely to become the mother of Judah's tribal representative. And then she had twin sons born. Here again, she wanted to carry on that line for whatever reason that she felt she needed to do that. as we are by the incestuous way Tamar sought to aid the perpetuation of Judah's line, a fruitful race followed, God not sanctioning but overriding evil to his own good purpose. It shocks our inner finer feelings to see Christ's lineage interwoven with such abhorrent degradation as we have in this chapter. We cannot but wonder how Judah and Tamar have distinction of mention in that sacred genealogy of Jesus Christ. But as Bishop Hall expressed it, God's election is only by grace, for otherwise Judah would never have been chosen. Judah was a Jew, Tamar a Gentile, and thus their parentage of Pharez can be looked upon as a foreshadowing of the fact that both Jews and Gentiles were to share in the blessings of the gospel. And it's still when you think about it, it's like, okay, these people were all evil, but they're all in Jesus' line.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking Judah too, because he married a Canaanite woman. They weren't supposed to marry the Canaanites. He married a Canaanite woman. And then, like, I was just going back here and reading, and it said so his firstborn, he picked Tamar for his firstborn. But his firstborn was so evil that God killed him.
Yeah.
Then Omen, he's the one that and he's the one that's a semen on the ground.
Yes. Yeah. I just thought there was some, when you think about it, how evil clear back the line of Jesus was, and God still found a way to get by all that evil.
Mm-hmm. Over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it said that he feared that Sheila would die like his brother, so that's why he didn't. But I'm like, what in the world? But then I think, Judah is also the one that sold his brother, Joseph, into
Yep.
slavery.
Yeah.
And I wonder why God picked Judah and just not Joseph. Well, I guess he
Yeah.
did. I guess he did. No, he was one of the 12 tribes. So Jesus came from Judah's line, right?
Yeah.
Am I confusing myself? Yeah,
Yeah. He
Joseph
was
would have
from
been one of
Judah's
the
line.
12. So then he had, I don't know,
Anyway, okay.
all very
Um,
confusing.
yeah. The events in this chapter seem to interrupt the story, but actually they take place during the time of Joseph's story. Joseph was 17 when he was sold and 30 years old when he was elevated to the throne, which gives us 13 years. When you add the 7 years of plenty and the 2 years of famine, you have 22 years before Joseph was reconciled to his brothers. There's plenty of time for Judah to marry, beget 3 sons, bury 2 sons, and a wife, and get involved with Tamar. If his marriage had occurred before Joseph's exile, you have even more time available.
Before you get
Why
too
is this?
far, I'm sorry, before you get too far, what was those years again? That he came to
Um,
27?
Joseph was 17 when he was sold,
Okay, hang on, Joseph.
30 years
17 when sold.
30 years old when he was elevated to the throne. So that gives you 13 years there.
Elevated to, wait, 30 years?
30 years when he was elevated to the throne. 30 years
Oh,
old.
okay, I see. Between 17 and
Yeah,
30.
there's 13 years between 17 and the 30.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. And then when you add the 7 years of plenty, the 2 years of famine, you have 22 years before Joseph was reconciled to his brothers.
22 years.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. History. One of the major purposes of Genesis is to record the origin and development of the family of Jacob, the founder of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Israelites went down to Egypt, a large family, And 4 centuries later, they came out of Egypt a large nation. Since the tribe of Judah is the royal tribe from which the Messiah would come, anything related to Judah is vital to the story in Genesis. Without this chapter, you'd wonder at finding Tamar and Perez in our Lord's genealogy. There's a note here. 3 other women besides Mary are named in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. In Matthew 1, you have Tamar, verse 3, Rahab, and Ruth. It was unusual to name women in Jewish genealogy, and especially women such as these 3. Tamar was a Canaanite who posed as a prostitute. Rahab was a prostitute in Jericho, and Ruth was a Moabitess who converted to Judaism. All 3 were Gentiles, and 2 of them, Tamar and Rahab, had unsavory reputations. What a demonstration of grace of God. Back to what we were saying. Perez was an ancestor of King David and therefore an ancestor of Jesus Christ. Morality. But this chapter has some practical values as well. For one thing, it shows how dangerous it was for God's people to be in the land with the Canaanites. There was always a temptation to live like your neighbors instead of like the people of God. There's also a dramatic contrast between Judah and Joseph. Joseph refused to compromise himself with Potiphar's wife, but Judah casually slept with a strange woman he thought was a prostitute. We also see the continued harvest in the family because of deception. Jacob used a garment to deceive his father Isaac, and Judah and his brothers used a garment to deceive Jacob. Now Tamar used a garment to deceive Judah. We reap what we sow. Covenant community. Judah got himself into trouble when he separated himself from his brothers and started to make friends with the Canaanites in the land. Like Samson, he saw a woman he liked and took her to be his wife. Both Abraham and Isaac had been careful to see to it that their sons didn't marry women of the land, lest the chosen seed of Israel be polluted with idolatry and immorality. Joseph's brothers were doing things that their fathers disapproved of, but Joseph was still safer with them than with the people of the land. At least their presence reminded Joseph that he was a child of covenant. Grace. The story of the patriarchs in Genesis reminds us of the grace of God and his sovereignty in human life. The men and women who played a part in this important drama weren't perfect, and some of them were deliberately disobedient, and yet the Lord used them to accomplish his purposes. This doesn't mean that God approved of their sins, because their sins were ultimately revealed and judged. But it does mean that God can take the weak things of this world and accomplish his purposes. Now back to the story of Joseph.
Early on, you said so and so deceived so and so, and so deceived so and so, kind of like a generational thing. Can you?
Yeah. Let's see. We see the continued harvest in the family because of deception. Jacob used a garment to deceive his father Isaac.
Okay, Jacob to Isaac.
Judah and his brothers used a garment to deceive Jacob.
Okay.
Now Tamar used a garment to deceive Judah. Just keeps going and going.
Garment deception, I'll call that. Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Any thoughts on that?
There was one more note here. God put a wall between the Jews and Gentiles, not because the Jews were better than other nations, but because they were different, set apart for his divine purposes. Once the Savior had come and died for the sins of the world, God made it clear there is no difference.
Well, I think our separation is not to become unequally yoked.
Yeah.
All right, Amber, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I'm reading all of 38, right?
Correct.
All right, 38, 1 through 2. Much of the rest of Genesis focuses on Joseph, but to remind us of the line of succession, the author briefly steps away from his story to focus on one of Joseph's brothers. Judah would eventually become the son to inherit the promise and blessing of Abraham, but at this point in the story, he was just another conniving member of a dysfunctional family. For instance, it was Judah who came up with the idea of selling Joseph as a slave. The following narrative further reveals Judah's deeply flawed character. Judah married the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua, which was an inauspicious start. Not only had Judah married one of the pagan Canaanites, but he also appeared to have given the marriage no thought at all. He saw a woman he wanted, he went for her. Such impulsive lust would soon get Judah into trouble. 38, 3 through 10. Judah's wife had three sons, Onan, and Shelah. The eldest son, married a woman named Tamar. Unfortunately, was evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death, leaving Tamar with no husband and no children. The custom of the day in situations such as this was for the next living brother of the deceased to marry the widow. The first son from this marriage then would legally belong to the deceased older brother, providing him an heir and preserving his name. Onan, the brother in line for this task, was fine with taking Tamar as his wife, but because he knew that the offspring would not be his, he intentionally avoided getting her pregnant.
You know
In
what?
other words,
It just hit me. He didn't want to give his brother's name because at this point he would be the one who would get the double portion.
hmm,
Once he produced the child for his brother, the brother's child would be the one that got the double portion. That's why. And that's why it
hmm.
was so evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're okay. In other words, he was using Tamar for sexual gratification while refusing his responsibility to her and his brother. God was neither pleased nor deceived by this, so he put him to death also. 38, 11 through 15. Tamar, now a widow twice over and still childless, was in a tough position. Legally, she could expect to marry Shelah, the third son, but Judah seemed to blame Tamar for the death of his other two sons, and he refused to arrange the marriage, knowing that the only way to secure inheritance rights for her was to produce offspring. Tamar took matters into her own hand. She took off her widow's clothes, veiled her face, and posed as a prostitute. Apparently, Tamar knew Judah's lustful ways, and she planned to lure him. 38, 16 through 23. Wages, whether for prostitution or any other transaction, were often given in pledges in those days. Judah agreed to pay the supposed prostitute with a young goat, and as a guarantee that he would follow through with this, he left his signet ring and his staff. Both would have had markings uniquely identifying Judah as their owner. So when Judah was unable to retrieve his belongings, he knew he was liable to become a laughingstock. His lack of impulse control had given someone the power to blackmail him. 38, 24 through 26. When it became obvious that Tamar was pregnant, Judah responded with self-righteous hypocrisy. Bring her out and let her be burned to death. Yet with excellent timing and a thick sense of irony, Tamar responded by sending his missing pledge to him and asked, whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these? The question she posed to Judah bears a resemblance to the question Judah and his brothers posed to their father Jacob after faking Joseph's death. Thus Judah, the deceiver, was deceived in kind. He immediately recognized his guilt, knowing that Tamar had acted desperately because he refused to give her as a wife to his son Shelah. Tamar gave birth to twins, and just as with Jacob and Esau, the older of these two, Zerah, would serve the younger. Thus the line of Judah, which was the covenant line, was preserved and continued. Even in the midst of sinful circumstances, God's program will not be thwarted. He never accepts or condones sin, but he can still use sin to sovereignly accomplish his kingdom plan.
I think it's interesting that we have all these twins, that there's issues with all of them. Like every time, like every main junction, there's like a twins born. Any other thoughts on chapter 38 or any commentaries anybody wants to share? All right, then we'll move on to 39, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Kim, are you up to reading this morning?
Yes.
I don't have any breaks in this, but it is only 10 o'clock, so we might be okay. Is Worsby long on this chapter?
He's about a page and a half, something like that. Not real long.
We could probably get through it. Kim, if you don't mind reading the entire chapter.
That's fine. I do have a thought though. So now Judah and Tamar had to have this child. So, with the brothers were killed because they didn't want another child to have their inheritance, but now it happened anyway. So now I wonder if it ever acknowledges that. So now these twins are going to be Judah's heirs instead of Sheila. Anyway,
It would be Perez, right? Yeah, because Perez was behind and then he pushed forward.
Yeah.
So it would be Perez that ended up being the firstborn birthright.
So
who also then had David and Jesus in his line.
Okay. Yeah. All right. 39. Joseph is thrown into jail. When Joseph arrived in Egypt as a captive of the Ishmaelite leaders, he was purchased from them by Potiphar, a member of the personal staff of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Now this man Potiphar was the captain of the king's bodyguard and his chief executioner. The Lord greatly blessed Joseph there in the home of his master, so that everything he did succeeded. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph in a very special way. So Joseph naturally became quite a favorite with him. Soon he was put in charge of the administration of Potiphar's household and all of his business affairs. At once the Lord began blessing Potiphar for Joseph's sake. All of his household affairs began to run smoothly, his crops flourished, and his flocks multiplied. So Potiphar gave Joseph the complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. He hadn't a worry in the world with Joseph there, except to decide what he wanted to eat. Joseph, by the way, was a very handsome young man. One day at about this time, Potiphar's wife began making eyes at Joseph and suggested that he come and sleep with her. Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in the entire household. He himself has no more authority here than I have. He has held back nothing from me except you yourself, because you are his wife. How can I do such a wicked thing as this? It would be a great sin against God. But she kept on with her suggestions day after day, even though he refused to listen and kept out of her way as much as possible. Then one day, as he was in the house going about his work, as it happened, no one else was around at the time, she came and grabbed him by the sleeve, demanding, sleep with me. He tore himself away, but as he did, his jacket slipped off and she was left holding it as he himself and tore himself away, but as he did, his jacket slipped off, and she was left holding it as he fled from the house. When she saw that he had his jacket and that he had fled, she began screaming, and when the other men around the place came running in to see what had happened, she was crying hysterically. My husband had to bring in this Hebrew slave to insult us, she sobbed. He tried to rape me, but when I screamed, he ran and forgot to take his jacket. She kept the jacket, and when her husband came home that night, she told him her story. That Hebrew slave you've had around here tried to rape me, and I was only saved by my screams. He fled, leaving his jacket behind. Well, when her husband heard his wife's story, he was furious. He threw Joseph into prison, where the king's prisoners were kept in chains. But the Lord was with Joseph there too, and was kind to him by granting him favor with the chief jailer. In fact, the jailer soon handed over the entire prison administration to Joseph, so that all the other prisoners were responsible to him. The chief jailer had no more worries after that, for Joseph took care of everything, and the Lord was with him so that everything ran smoothly and well.
Kathy, what's Worsby's first, like, where's a good cutting point?
He does 1 through 6 and then 7 through 20 and then 21 through 23.
Oh, okay. What do we,
Yeah, John hardly has anything.
okay, well then let's just go. Yeah.
Okay, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. Any and all ideas that Joseph, twice a victim of injustice, had been abandoned by the Lord are summarily banished by the employment of phrases highlighting God's oversight of his circumstances. That is, with him, made all he did prosper, found, gave him favor, blessed, blessing, and showed him mercy. Neither being unjustly sold into slavery and forcibly removed from the land, nor being unjustly accused of sexual harassment and imprisoned, were events signaling even a temporary loss of divine superintendence of Joseph's life and God's purpose for his people Israel. 2-4, successful overseer of his house. This involved authority as the steward of the whole estate. One of the criteria for which was trust. No doubt, Joseph was conversant in the Egyptian language. Verse 5, blessing of the Lord. Joseph was experiencing fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, even at the time before Israel was in the land. Verse 6, except for the bread which he ate. Since Joseph proved trustworthy enough to need no oversight, his master concerned himself only with his own meals or his very own personal affairs. Joseph himself remarked that Potiphar had delegated to him so much that he no longer knew the full extent of his own business affairs. In fact, he only knew what was set before him. Verse 9, this great wickedness. Joseph explained when first tempted that adultery would be a gross violation of his ethical convictions, which demanded 1, the utmost respect for his master, and 2, a life of holiness before his God. Far more was involved than compliance with the letter of an ancient Near Eastern law code, many of which did forbid adultery, but rather obedience to the moral standards belonging to one who walked with God, and that long before Mosaic law code prescriptions applied. 10-18. Her incessant efforts to seduce Joseph failed in the face of his strong convictions not to yield nor be compromised. At flashpoint, Joseph fled. Based on false accusations, Joseph was deemed guilty and imprisoned. For a New Testament picture of see 2 Timothy 2:22 for a New Testament picture of Joseph's attitude. Verse 12, his garment. See chapter 37, 31-35. For the other time, one of Joseph's cloaks was used in a conspiracy against him. Verse 17, Hebrew servant. This term was used by Potiphar's wife as a pejorative intended to heap scorn upon someone considered definitely unworthy of any respect. Its use may also suggest some latent attitudes toward dwellers in Canaan, which could be aggravated to her advantage. Potiphar's wife also neatly shifted the blame onto her husband for having hired the Hebrew in the first place, and stated this also before the servants. 19 and 20. The death penalty for adultery may not have applied to a charge of attempted adultery, attempted seduction, or rape. So Potiphar consigned Joseph to the prison reserved for royal servants, from where, in the providence of God, he would be summoned into Pharaoh's presence and begin the next stage of his life. 21. Showed him mercy. God did not permit this initial painful imprisonment to continue. 22 and 23. Once again, Joseph, though in circumstances considerably less comfortable than Potiphar's home, rose to a position of trust and authority and proved to be trustworthy enough not to need any insight. And that's the end of it.
All right, Kathy. I do find it interesting that with this is twice now we're talking about the garments. Like, I feel like there's like a deeper message there.
Okay. The Egypt in which Joseph found himself was primarily a land of small villages inhabited by peasants who worked the land and raised grain and vegetables. Thanks to their system of irrigation, the annual flooding of the Nile River supplied ample water for both the crops and cattle. There were some large cities, such as On, which is Hierapolis, where Ra, the sun god, was honored, and Memphis, devoted to Apis, the sacred bull, but most of the population lived in small villages. It was also a country shackled by religious superstition. The people recognized at least 2,000 gods and goddesses, including Pharaoh himself, and the special emphasis was on preparing for the afterlife when the god Osiris would judge one's deeds in a very real sense. Egypt was a land devoted to death as much as to life. Let's see here. Egyptian priests and wise men studied the heavens and the earth, developed a solar year calendar of 365 and a quarter days, and became well known for their medicines. They also perfected the art of embalming. The Egyptians had horses and chariots, and they knew the art of war.
What was the calendar?
365 and a quarter days.
The Egyptian calendar.
Yeah.
And then what did it say about the god Ra? That was their, I thought he was like the sun god. That was
Yeah,
the
he was
god.
He was a sun god.
Do you ever hear that song? Ra, 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 ra. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I never really thought about that till you said that, but I've heard that song.
Dinner music.
Okay. Share in God's blessing, verses 1 to 6. When he was at home in Hebron, Joseph's brothers considered him to be a troublemaker, but in Egypt he was a source of blessing because God was with him. God promised Abraham that his descendants would bring blessing to other nations, and Joseph fulfilled that promise in Egypt. Like the blessed man described in Psalm 1, everything he did prospered. Joseph is a good example of a believer who trusted God and made the best of his difficult circumstances. He never read what Jeremiah wrote to the exiles in Babylon or what Peter wrote to the scattered Christians in the Roman Empire, but he certainly put those instructions into practice. Joseph would rather have been at home, but he made the best of his circumstances in Egypt, and God blessed him. The blessing of the Lord was very evident to the people in Potiphar's household, and they knew that Joseph was the cause. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, just as God had blessed Laban's house because of Jacob. Potiphar gradually turned more and more responsibility over to Joseph until Joseph was actually managing the entire household except for the food Potiphar ate. There's a note here: the Egyptians didn't eat with the Hebrews. It wasn't so much a matter of diet as their exclusive attitude toward other peoples. I was kind of wondering why it mentioned that even the food he ate, he left him decide all that.
Yeah. Just a quick note, Ra, the Egyptian sun god, was worshipped through elaborate rituals, temple construction, and symbolic representation. Pharaohs were seen as Ra's sons. And they built sun temples and pyramids in his honor. So the pyramids were built to honor Ra. And the priest performed daily rituals offering food, drink, and other offerings to Ra's image. He's also depicted as a solar disk with falcon wings, and his daily journey through the sky and underworld was a central theme in his worship. Thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Joseph was well liked by the people in Potiphar's house and in pagan idol-worshipping Egypt. Joseph was the testimony to the true and living God. He was an honest and faithful worker, and the people he lived and worked with got the message. God took note of Joseph's character and conduct and made him a blessing and unknown to Joseph. God planned to fulfill the dreams he had sent him. Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men. Proverbs 22:29. There's a note here. It's interesting to see how the life of Joseph illustrates the history of Israel. Like the nation of Israel, Joseph was a blessing to the Gentiles. He suffered at their hand, and he was accused and maligned. And yet he was delivered to become a ruler and help to save nations. Daniel's experience in Babylon paralleled the experience of Joseph in Egypt. Like Joseph, Daniel was taken from his home, his name was changed, he interpreted dreams, he was promoted, and he was a source of blessing to Gentiles. But his faithful service wasn't only a blessing to the household, it was also a blessing to Joseph himself. Had he stayed home with his pampering father, Joseph might not have developed the kind of character that comes from hard work and obeying orders. God's method for building us is to give us a job to do and people to obey. He tests us as servants before he promotes us to being rulers. Before he allows us to exercise authority, we have to be under authority and learn to obey. The description of Joseph in Genesis 39:6 prepares the way for the episode involving Potiphar's wife. Not only was Joseph godly, dependable, and efficient, but he was also handsome and well-favored, qualities he inherited from his mother. Verses 7-20, overcoming great temptation. Joseph had suffered in a pit because of the hatred of his brothers, but now he would face an even greater danger because of the lust of an evil woman. For a harlot is a deep pit, and a seductress in a narrow well. Proverbs 23:27. Potiphar's wife treated Joseph in a humiliating way by inviting him into her bed. She may have reasoned, after all, isn't he a Jew and a slave at that? And doesn't he work for my husband and therefore also work for me? Since my husband isn't here, I'm in charge and Joseph is my employee. It's his job to take orders. She treated Joseph like a thing, not like a person, and when her advances were rejected, she turned against him. No matter how much people talk about love and defend sex outside of marriage, the experience is wrong, cheap, and demeaning. Fornication and adultery change a pure river into a sewer and transform free people into slaves and then animals. What begins as sweetness soon turns into poison. Joseph wasn't about to sacrifice either his purity or his integrity just to please his master's wife. It took a great deal of courage and determination for Joseph to fight this battle day after day, but he succeeded. He explained to her why he wouldn't cooperate. 1, she was another man's wife, and that man was his master. 2, he was trusted by his master and didn't want to violate that trust. 3, if nobody else found out about it, God would know it, and he would be displeased. All she asked for was a moment of pleasure, but to Joseph, that was a great wickedness against God. Potiphar's wife probably arranged for the other servants to be out of the way on the day she launched her greatest attack, but at the same time, she saw to it that they were near enough at hand for her to call them to see Joseph's garment. There are times when fleeing could be a mark of cowardice, but there are also times when fleeing is evidence of courage and integrity. Joseph was wise enough to follow the same advice Paul gave to Timothy: flee the evil desires of youth. Self-control is an important factor in building character and preparing us for leadership. Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. Proverbs 25:28. When there are no walls, anything can get in or come out. Joseph exercised self-control, but Samson used his body to gratify his own pleasures, and Joseph ended up ruling on a throne, while Samson ended his life buried in a pile of rubble. For the second time in his life, Joseph lost a garment. But as the Puritan preacher said, Joseph lost his coat, but he kept his character. Since Potiphar was involved in the Egyptian judicial system, we wonder why he didn't try to put Joseph on trial or even execute him. Of course, God was in control, working out his wonderful plan for Joseph, Egypt, Joseph's family, and the world. There's a note here. Potiphar knew that Joseph was the reason for the prosperity of his household, and he may have questioned whether his wife was telling the truth. After all, the evidence was purely circumstantial, and it was her word against Joseph's. But Potiphar had to choose between justice and a happy home, and after all, Joseph was a slave and a Jew. We wonder how Joseph dealt with Potiphar and his wife a few years later, when he was the second ruler of the land.
When I was watching Alexander the Great's documentary, one of the things about the Egyptian, like when Cleopatra came up through, like it was common for brothers and sisters to be married. So, and they would rule together as gods. So I think that's interesting. Like, and it was common for, like, I think Cleopatra was the last female pharaoh, but I gotta wonder how if she had more power in the house than what we're assuming she has.
Okay, 21 through 23. Once again, it was the Lord who made the difference. Whether Joseph was a steward in Potiphar's house or an accused criminal in prison, the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success. Learning to wait. They bruised his feet with shackles. His neck was put in irons, said the psalmist. But these experiences aren't mentioned in Genesis. Perhaps Joseph was bound for a short time, but it wasn't long before the prison warden released him and put him in charge of other prisoners. Like Potiphar before him, the warden turned everything over to Joseph and watched the work prosper in his hands. God permitted Joseph to be treated unjustly and put in prison to help build his character and prepare him for the task that lay ahead. The prison would be a school where Joseph would learn to wait on the Lord until it was his time to vindicate him and fulfill his dreams. Joseph had time to think and pray and to ponder the meaning of the 2 dreams God had sent him. He would learn that God's delays are not God's denials. More than one servant of God has regretted rushing ahead of God's schedule and trying to get to the throne too soon. Dr. D. Martin Lloyd-Jones used to say, "It's tragic when a person succeeds before he's ready for it. It's through faith and patience that we inherit the promises, and the best way to learn patience is through tribulation. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall, into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. James 1:2-4. God often removes our crutches so we learn to walk by faith and trust him alone. 2 years later, God would use the cupbearer to help deliver Joseph from prison. Thus, Joseph's request wasn't wasted. During these 2 years of waiting, Joseph clung to the dreams God had given him, just the way you and I would cling to his promises. God had promised that the people would bow down to Joseph, and he believed God's promise. He didn't know how God would accomplish it or when it would happen, but he knew that God was faithful. The end.
Amber, how long is Tony? Can it be done in 5 minutes?
Probably. I think so.
Okay, go ahead.
39, 1-2. At the same time that Judah was proving his own immorality, younger brother Joseph was showing the opposite characteristic of purity. Joseph's circumstances, though, started off much more grim than Judah's. He had been taken to Egypt as a slave, but because the Lord was with Joseph, he became a successful man in the house of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards. He may have been a slave, but God was with him. Joseph's life proves the lesson taught by the sponge. When you fill a sponge with water and then add pressure, water comes out. Joseph was so full of God's presence that when life squeezed him, evidence of his dedication to God oozed out, and he became a successful man. 39:3. The secret to Joseph's success was his walk with God. Notice that Potiphar didn't just see Joseph's good work ethic, he saw that the Lord was with him. That suggests Joseph didn't mind telling Potiphar about the Lord, because how else would Potiphar have known about him? Joseph became useful to God because of his faith. God's presence is never idle. 39:4-5. Because Joseph knew that God was with him, he became the best employee in Potiphar's house. Potiphar placed all that he owned under his authority, and the Lord's blessing was on all that he owned, in his house and in his fields. Joseph thus shows how we should all conduct ourselves when working with our non-Christians. We should be the most punctual, most productive, most trustworthy, most honest employees in our companies. Knowing God is with us should make us stand out dramatically. 39:6-7. Joseph grew so central to Potiphar's enterprise that Potiphar essentially gave him the keys to his estate. Things were beginning to look up for Joseph, but then Potiphar's wife started to meddle. Seeing that Joseph was well built and handsome, she wanted to seduce him. Her advances weren't subtle. "Sleep with me," she said, cutting straight to the point. 39:8-9. Joseph responded to Potiphar's wife's solicitation wisely. His reaction is a sort of template for how we should resist temptation, sexual or otherwise. First, he saw that the consequences of sin would be damaging. Potiphar had placed all his possessions under Joseph's authority. To sleep with his master's wife would ruin that trust and surely lead to harsh consequences. More importantly, he recognized that what makes sin sinful is that it is an immense evil committed against God. People who love God don't need to be told to avoid sin. They instinctively hate sin because they don't want to pierce the heart of the one who chose them and set his affection on them. 39:10-20. Unfortunately, Potiphar's wife was relentless. She spoke to Joseph day after day, even though he kept rejecting her advances. Then one day, when no one was around, she grabbed him by his garment and gave her trademark line, "Sleep with me." Joseph bolted, which was the right move, but in doing so, he left his garment with her. So Potiphar's wife flipped the script and spun a story about Joseph trying to rape her. This created a no-win situation for Joseph. No one else witnessed the event. His garment was in her possession, served as evidence. He was a foreigner, and most importantly, she was the boss's wife. The resulting fallout was as predictable as it was unjust. Potiphar heard the story his wife told him, grew furious, and had Joseph thrown into prison. 39:21-23. Joseph's situation seemed even worse than when he'd showed up in Egypt. Back then, he was a slave, but at least he had a job. Now he was in prison. Nevertheless, in the midst of a horrid situation, the Lord was with Joseph. God wasn't surprised by anything that happened to him, and before long, Joseph had gained such a good reputation that the warden put all the prisoners under Joseph's authority, making the prisoner the warden. This is just the kind of thing God can do when we trust him in our detours. He may not take us out of jail at our request, but he will come in and join us in it. And living with God's presence in the middle of jail offers a truer freedom than living without God anywhere else ever could.
Perfect timing. Any other commentaries, thoughts?
I like that comment that you made about the garments, because it's interesting that the brothers used the coat that Jacob gave Joseph to deceive Jacob, and his jacket was used by Potiphar's wife to deceive Potiphar.
Yeah, and then
Andrew.
earlier we had talked to Kathy when she read Jacob used the garment to deceive Isaac, Judah used the garment to deceive Jacob, and Tamar used a garment to deceive Judah. So that it's like this ongoing thing.
Yeah.
All right. We are ready for the trivia. If you want to unmute yourselves. This one might be a little harder because I had to think about it. Did not know the answer. See if Julie's got this one. What mountain did Caleb inherit as his rewards? And we did read this, I just didn't remember it.
Mount Orb.
Good guess. Good guess. Hebron. He received Mount Hebron. You can find that in Joshua 14, verse 13. I guess Joshua and Caleb, that was his reward for being obedient. All right. This concludes the reading of God's word for today. Until tomorrow.
For sure and for certain.
For certain.
All
You're
right.
not here tomorrow, though, right?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
Friday? Okay.
Monday, we're not here.
Okay. All right.
Great. Love y'all.
Glad we. Love
you.
you.
Yeah.